Now, it is easy to think that with the new administration, the change of administration in the Philippines, things are okay. But we need a reality check. The extrajudicial killings perpetrated under the drug war of former President Rodrigo Duterte has reached 30,000 people, almost the same number as the killings in Gaza, Israel, Palestine. And the perpetrators of the violence remain scot-free. My voice is trembling because I could feel the pain. And this war on drugs is not just a metaphor, it is really war. And like any war, it has violence, it has victims, it has prisoners. And therefore, thank you for joining us in updating the world on the situation in the Philippines. Now, it's not just the extrajudicial killings. The punitive paradigm under the drug war of President Duterte has left our prisons really bloated, full packed, because of the unjustly caught and accused prisoners. There's also the legacy of the distortion of even the concept of human rights. And I must admit that distortion of the concept of human rights has affected even some religious people. Fortunately, we have today Senator Leila de Lima online, who has become the symbol and the embodiment of what has been ugly in the past several years, but also as the symbol and embodiment of what is resilient and courageous and virtuous among the Filipino people.
Recording in progress.
So she has been in jail for 7 years, almost 7 years. And it's a great sacrifice, Madam Leila de Lima, for you to be with us today. We stand here, we sit here to listen to your wisdom. Given the situation, how do you describe the human rights situation in the Philippines, and can you offer a framework for appreciating our struggle? Senator Leila, it's yours.
Thank you, Father Albert. Good afternoon to my co-panelists, Professor Reyes, Mr. Alison Smith, Ms. Samantha David, and of course, Father Albert Alejo, SJ, our moderator, and to all participants in this forum. My appreciation goes to Franciscans International and its partners organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute in today's event. Last February, UN Special Rapporteur Irene Can visited us in the Philippines and was able to discuss the Philippine human rights situation with local stakeholders such as myself, who was also a victim of Duterte's drug war. I congratulate her for a fruitful visit and thank her for her efforts to bring to light the crisis and human rights we are experiencing in the Philippines. I wish to provide further context to the topic we are discussing today. After reading the concept note for this event, I decided to share a political framework to help us put in context the human rights situation in the Philippines. But first, I want to be clear that politics or ideology is never an excuse for the neglect and abuse of human rights. Quite the contrary, human rights should always be respected, observed, and advanced, regardless of current political realities. Human rights cannot be invoked only when it is convenient, then readily ignored once it becomes inconvenient. There is a dysfunctional dynamic that has more or less dominated the HR discourse in the Philippines for the past half-century. This is the generally unacknowledged symbiotic relationship between the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or the AFP, and the Communist Party of the Philippines and its New People's Army, or CPP-NPA. By symbiotic, I mean the reliance of each group on each other to justify its own existence, differing only in perspective on how they see each other. Both see their respective group of armed combatants as the protector of the people against the other in a war that has claimed mostly the lives of those they claim to protect. This internecine warfare always determined the character of the HR crisis in the Philippines. And after more than half a century, this situation largely remains unchanged. During her visit, Ms. Can called on the Marcos administration to abolish the NTF-ELCAC, the unabashedly anti-communist government task force still steeped in Cold War propaganda. The NTF-ELCAC justifies its existence using the insurgent activities of an arguably moribund communist armed movement, drawing large amounts of funds from the national coffers to control and to dispose of as it sees fit in the name of anti-insurgency. The use of these funds contributes to a history throwback, low-intensity conflict against a rebel group that has, in general, blurred the lines between armed combatants and legitimate trade union leaders, community organizers, and human rights defenders. Most of our political prisoners come from this class of personalities who were proceeded against by the military as armed combatants. This in itself is a human rights violation, but seen by almost all Philippine administrations as a legitimate strategy against the insurgency. The NTF-ELCAC was organized during the term of Duterte, but under other administrations, it went by other names. And unlike its present manifestation, which is media hungry, vocal, and almost personal in its targeting of victims, was generally low profile. To counter the legacy of NTF-ELCAC's predecessor, under the Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo or GMA administration, which went by the name Interagency Legal Action Group or the IALAG, the Aquino administration came out with Administrative Order 35, creating the Interagency Committee on Extralegal Killings and Forced Disappearances, Torture, and other grave HRVs. This interagency committee aimed to monitor and facilitate the prosecution of HRV cases, including those involving non-combatants identified under the GMA administration as legitimate targets for counterinsurgency. In its first months, the Aquino administration dropped the charges against the Morong 43 due to the illegality of the arrest of the targeted individuals by the military, thus pronouncing President Aquino's policy of prioritizing human rights over the AFP's perennial preoccupation with counterinsurgency. After the term of President Aquino, something new and strange happened during the first few months of the Duterte administration. On day one of his term, Duterte announced the implementation of his bloody war on drugs. What was strange and new was that the New People's Army came out with an official statement supporting Duterte's drug war and promising their active participation in the hunt for suspected drug offenders. However, for the long-time observer of Philippine politics, this was not entirely strange. As mayor of Davao, Duterte entered into an alliance with the local armed communist group in a sort of political détente outside of the national policy of defeating the armed rebellion. He built trust among the rebels, even visiting their camps and raising clenched fists among them. Before declaring his presidential ambitions, Duterte allowed the NPA to hold its funeral parade for Commander Parago right in the middle of the streets of Davao City, Mindanao's largest urban center. As president, Duterte's alliance with the CPP-NPA only lasted until his realization that he cannot survive politically without the AFP or the military. This is when he turned his sights as well on his former allies to appease his generals. Necessarily, the hunt for activists and organizers also resumed, thus resulting in the characterization of the human rights crisis under Duterte as counterinsurgency induced as well as drug war generated. It is also around this time, of course, that the CPP-NPA started condemning Duterte's drug war EJKs after supporting them when they were still in bed together. Eventually, Duterte's personal declaration of war against the CPP-NPA resulted once again in the increase of HRVs, the usual targets, as in any counterinsurgency policy in the Philippines, being non-combatant mass leaders, labor organizers, student activists, and local political cadres. This recurrent, seemingly never-ending counterinsurgency policy against a moribund armed movement survives up to the BBM administration and its AFP. Hence, the continuing prevalence of HRVs against those identified with the cause of the armed combatants, no matter how peaceful and legitimate in character their modes of engagement are. This is where we are now in the HR situation in the Philippines. We are back to square one in the proliferation of EJKs, torture, and forced disappearances, abductions, illegal arrests and detentions, sexual assault on women activists, various forms of political harassment, and outright deprivation of basic civil liberties, such as the freedom of association and expression. There is still HRVs, which are the remnants of Duterte's drug war. The question is, are the EJKs still state-sanctioned or state-inspired? Are the death squads still being funded as they used to from the president's intelligence and confidential funds? The fault of the current administration is its continued failure to prosecute any mastermind of the Duterte EJKs, instead of adopting an unwritten policy of letting the murder of thousands of suspected drug offenders and innocent bystanders slip away without any form of reckoning and accountability. At the same time, it continues to deny ICC jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute those responsible for the drug war and refuses cooperation with the ICC. This is unfortunate, considering that for the families of drug war victims, the ICC is their last real hope to attain justice for their loved ones. With the exit of Duterte, HRVs in the Philippines are thus back to being largely political in nature, resulting from the symbiotic internecine bloodletting between state security forces and the armed rebel movement. Each continues to draw its energy and reason for existence from the other in a half-century struggle for the hearts and minds of the victimized civilian population, long exhausted of the mindless, aimless, senseless, and longest-running insurgency in the world today. I submit that mechanisms such as AO35 and EJKs should be fully harnessed by the Marcos administration to send notice to the AFP that HRVs will not be tolerated. Without question, the NTF-ELCOC should be abolished and its victims recognized for purposes of compensation by the state. On the other hand, child recruitment and the involvement of IP communities as armed combatants for either side should also cease. We should return these hinterland societies to a state of protection as peace zones as they used to be in the past. Tagging of armed combatants as terrorists should also be sparing in the absence of the use of terrorist methods and conduct prohibited under the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute. Most importantly, the curriculum of the AFP should be revised and reoriented towards external defense instead of counterinsurgency to finally put an end to the AFP's partisan ideological indoctrination. In summation, any further discussion on the states and non-states actors' accountability for continuing HRVs in the Philippines must recognize this political context on why the Filipino people continue to be victimized in an ideological war that the world has already long forgotten and that no one alive today still understands, except that the parties are just trapped in a perpetual loop, locked in conflict, for even God no longer knows what. Again, thank you for the opportunity to make this intervention in today's event.
I am friend of Senator Leila de Lima, who attended all the hearings, the court hearings during the past 7 years. So, Reyes.
Thank you very much, Madam Bird, and thank you everyone for coming and joining us this afternoon. As this is Women's International Month, my topic will be misogyny, authoritarianism, and women's human rights. Women human rights defenders face the enormous risk of misogynistic attacks in an authoritarian regime to provoke fear, stifle dissent, and cow them into submission. Misogyny is hatred of, contempt for, or prejudice against women or girls. It manifests in various ways, such as social exclusion, sex discrimination, hostility, ethnocentrism, male privilege, belittling of women, disenfranchisement of women, violence against women, and sexual objectification. During his presidency, Duterte utilized every opportunity to lambaste women who threatened his leadership and opposed the abuses that the nation continued to suffer under his leadership. It began with jokes said on podiums. He joked to soldiers that they can rape women with impunity. And I quote, "If you had raped 3, I will admit it. That's on me." He told soldiers in Mindanao, where he has imposed martial law. In a campaign rally when he was running for president, while referring to a 36-year-old Australian lay minister who was held hostage, raped, and her throat slashed and was shot in 1989, he said, and I quote, "I was angry because she was raped. That's one thing, but she was so beautiful. The mayor should have been first," unquote. The highest official of the land used his power and platform to objectify women and reduce their valuable contributions to society to sexist remarks. It then spread like a virus, one woman after another, vilified and slut-shamed when they begin to use their voice to expose the horrendous human rights abuses and egregious assaults against Filipinos. It crept through the strongholds of democracy, where women rose up to speak truth to power. Strong women who fought for the voiceless and powerless were either subjected to trumped-up charges, removed from power on faulty charges, or threats of criminal conviction. The law, which ought to protect them, was the very weapon used to silence them. Since 2016, Duterte launched endless misogynistic tirades against Senator De Lima. The senator sought relief from the Supreme Court and filed a petition for the writ of habeas data, asking the court to compel Duterte to remove damaging information about the petitioner, violating her rights to privacy. Duterte also called Senator De Lima an immoral, dirty woman. It was also Duterte who floated an obviously manufactured sex tape that his allies at the House of Representatives threatened to show in public as the House investigated a senator for alleged drug links. This prompted various women supporters of Senator Leila to post, and I quote, "I would like to testify at the House of Representatives. I am the woman in the sex video," unquote. The post went viral, and the group Every Woman was born. Every Woman is a coalition of individuals and organizations united in asserting and defending Filipino women's human dignity and rights, as well as protecting democratic space, especially women's meaningful political participation in view of the resurgence of authoritarianism and misogyny in government and society. It was not only Senator De Lima who was the object of misogynistic attacks by Duterte. After repeatedly expressing her criticism against Duterte's drug war, Duterte was quoted saying to former Chief Justice Lourdes Sereno, and I quote, "I'm putting you on notice that I'm your enemy and you have to be out of the Supreme Court," unquote. Not long after such threat, Sereno was pushed and ousted. She was the first Supreme Court justice to have been ousted based on a quo warranto petition when no less than the Constitution provides for an impeachment proceeding as the proper proceeding for such removal. At the helm of the online digital media company Rappler, neither Maria Resa's strength nor international prominence allowed her to dodge the bullet. With Rappler fearlessly publishing articles that exposed the horrors that the Duterte administration perpetrated, Maria Ressa was caught entangled in a battle against Duterte, who did not even try to conceal his seething anger against the former, with his public declaration that he was himself compiling information against Ressa. The latter was then embattled with charges, one after the other. Ressa has been exonerated since then and is now a Nobel Peace Prize awardee. For merely doing her job as the ombudsperson, Duterte launched a war against Justice Conchita Carpio Morales. She exposed her office investigation that resulted in the discovery of bank transactions of the president and his family through the years, which totaled more than 1 billion pesos or 19.63 million US dollars. This led Duterte to push for her impeachment and to taint her unblemished decades worth of reputation. How can we pursue accountability for human rights violation of Duterte, especially as it related to misogynistic attacks against women political leaders? On the legal front, he can be charged with violating the Magna Carta of Women, the omnibus law in the Philippines, that is the national translation of the Convention on the Elimination and all forms of discrimination against women. But there had not been a single case filed for its violation. Socially, several groups like the Movement Against Disinformation or MAD fights disinformation in social media through a diverse, nonpartisan coalition. It held a forum series on building legal guardians, safeguarding the public from the disinformation virus. It aims to protect the public's right to factual information and uphold the values of truth, transparency, and accountability. In conclusion, let me stress the following points. Number one, while women human rights defenders are continuously threatened in authoritarian patriarchal regimes, they have been unrelenting in their advocacy for truth, justice, and democracy. The case of Senator Leila de Lima showed how women political leaders remain steadfast in their struggle, even at the cost of their own professional careers, personal liberty, and separation from their families. Number two, women's groups like Every Woman have stood by, for, and with women leaders who have been vilified, oppressed, and slut-shamed by male political power holders. It is unfortunate, however, that in some occasions, women themselves in formal political positions have joined the male misogynists. And lastly, patriarchy and male authoritarianism are evident in the Duterte government. It will not end there. Patriarchy is a male-dominated power relationship evident in decision-making structures and processes in every level: the household, the community, the state, and the international organizations. Patriarchy is at the root of misogyny. Our advocacy work continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sok. So the war on drugs was also a war on women. Now, in the Philippines, we have so many civil society organizations, and one alliance, the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, or PAHRA, is represented here now by Ms. Samantha David, who is its project development officer. Samantha David, if you're ready.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to everyone watching from the Philippines. I will be talking about the United Nations Joint Program, or the UNJP, which was established in 2021 to address various human rights violations in the Philippines through 6 areas of engagement, including strengthening domestic investigative and accountability mechanisms, improving data gathering on alleged police violations, promoting civic space and engagement with civil society, enhancing the national mechanism for reporting and follow-up, advocating for a human rights-based approach to drug control, and finally, implementing a human rights-based and victim-centered approach to counterinsurgency. The UNJP was created in response to calls for accountability for prevalent human rights violations that occurred under the Duterte administration, which were exacerbated by the war on drugs. Critics, activists, and even the church were attacked. Human rights defenders, including Senator Leila de Lima, were unjustly imprisoned. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns legitimized these attacks and distorted the concept of human rights. Despite previous efforts by civil society and human rights organizations to advocate for an independent investigation, this was not realized and instead led to a resolution establishing the UNJP, which focused on technical cooperation. Still, groups engaged with the UNJP optimistic that an opportunity to address human rights concerns can be achieved through this program. The UNJP still had its gains. Some government offices expressed openness to engage in dialogue with CSOs, which used to be almost impossible before. The Department of Justice in particular initiated several meetings with CSOs where human rights concerns were raised. It also served as a platform to promote the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act and the CHR Charter. Resources became available for the development of human rights cities, organizing summits to discuss the safety of journalists, capacity building activities that deepened the understanding of existing human rights mechanisms. Additionally, economic, social, and cultural rights were given focus, emphasizing that its violation is correlated to the violation of civil and political rights. However, even with the implementation of the program, human rights violations persisted due to anti-human rights structures such as the anti-terror law, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict or the NTF-ELCAC, and Tokhang still in practice. An accountability mechanism addressing impunity is also yet to be developed. Since Marcos Jr. took his oath as president in 2022, there have been a rise in cases of enforced disappearances. Even with the legislation of the Anti-Enforced Disappearance Law, cases of disappearances have not been investigated as mandated in the said law. Despite Marcos Jr.'s statement on changing the approach to the war on drugs to one that focuses on rehabilitation, reintegration, and preventive education programs, he fails to acknowledge the human rights violations that occurred under the Duterte administration. His claims of the new drug response being bloodless contradicts the rising cases of extrajudicial killings recently documented by the HAS and other organizations. To quote the HAS, the monitoring covering the entire of 2023 yields a much higher number of casualties, 331. This is 7 more deaths than our total for 2022, which is 324. 149 in Duterte's last 6 months, and 175 in Marcos Jr.'s first. Since the beginning of 2024, they have reported a total of 86 drug-related killings. And in March 2022 of this year, just last Friday, Basted Duterte, the son of former President Rodrigo Duterte, has declared the continuation of the war on drugs in Davao. And in a span of 24 hours, 5 deaths have already been reported and continue to rise. Prior to this, killings have already been happening, putting Davao del Sur at the top list with the most cases of drug-related violations under the current administration. And yet, human rights violations still haven't been acknowledged by Marcos Jr., even if these have occurred under his term. Recently, the Dangerous Drugs Board proposed an enhanced policy on anti-drug strategy, but it still fails to consider state-perpetrated violations against persons who use or are suspected to use or involved in drugs, and does not provide justice and accountability mechanisms for victims and families of victims of the war on drugs. The burden is still placed on individuals rather than the system of impunity that allows the dehumanization of persons who use drugs. State perpetrators are not held accountable as data on deaths are manipulated to conceal the real cause of victims' deaths. We call for independent mandatory autopsy and the establishment of a forensics institute to facilitate the accurate investigation of killings. With the resumption of the International Criminal Court investigations, some families of victims are reluctant in pursuing cases due to threats from state actors. And all these persist even with the UNJP. Despite its gains, current efforts are still greatly disproportionate to address the situation of human rights in the Philippines. As the UNJP ends in July 2024, we fear that civic space will further shrink and impede the promotion and realization of human rights. But even before its end, the government is already planning to establish the Human Rights Coordinating Council to replace the UNJP. But until now, CSOs are not yet consulted on the content of the administrative order, posing a risk of the platform being co-opted for the government's own interest. The government has already showed its unwillingness to support the extension of the UNJP, but we continue to call for an independent assessment of the program and consider its extension or develop a new enhanced program that will genuinely address HRVs. We maintain our call for an independent investigation on human rights violations, especially cases related to the war on drugs during the Duterte administration, to hold perpetrators accountable and counter impunity. That's it. Thank you.
Samantha. Well, we have time for discussion. I could see some diplomatic representatives here. And so, Leila, are you ready for some questions or comments?
Okay.
So the table is now open. The floor is open for comments or questions. A number of things have been mentioned. United Nations joint program, which ends in July this year. There's a call for review. International Criminal Court. Misogyny. But human rights scope covers state and non-state actors as well. Yes, thanks.
Thanks from my office. Yeah. Thank you very much for these great and presentations. Unfortunately, I was a little bit late because I was stuck in traffic, so I must apologize. I missed a lot of the first information. But a question that I have is how you would evaluate from the UN Joint Program, the cooperation with civil society organizations, and what were the main factors there contributing maybe to the good cooperation or the lacking cooperation, and how could that be for any follow-up or further?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Maybe Samantha would like to say something more.
Yes, I couldn't hear the question clearly, but I believe it has something to do with the evaluation of the UNJP. So to evaluate the UNJP, like I mentioned, it had its own gains, but its implementation does not really address the main concerns, especially problems related to seeking accountability for human rights violations. So as civil society organizations, we recently had an assessment of the UN Joint Program and recommend the following actions. First is to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the UNJP implementation, preferably using the norms and standards for evaluation by the UN Evaluation Group. We also call for the review and assessment of the recommendations outlined in the report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights regarding the implementation of Human Rights Council Resolution 4533 and the progress and outcomes of technical cooperation and capacity building for the promotion of human rights in the Philippines, as presented during the 54th session on Human Rights Council last 2022. And like I mentioned earlier, we also hope to consider the possibility we hope for the international community to consider the possibility of extending or continuing the UNJP or a similar program, and also ensuring that it's accompanied by clearly defined goals and relevant, impactful activities to be led by independent and relevant institution that will facilitate its implementation. Because during our assessment, we were also afraid that if it's just the Human Rights Coordinating Council managing the human rights situation in the Philippines, and with them leading the human rights response, we're afraid that without multilateral approach to addressing the human rights concerns, it might not offer a fair evaluation of the human rights situation.
Thanks for joining us here in Vienna. I have a comment regarding the International Criminal Courts. To an extent, its operations are limited. To a great extent, the operations are limited by its budget situation. Last I read about the world for a wide set of cases. Even for those cases alone, in their current scope, observers consider the budget to be too low. And it's certainly falls well short of what could be possible for international criminal justice. There is a position of a number of member states to the Assembly of States Parties that there should be zero growth in the budget. And many, I'd say most of us in the NGO community engaged in advocacy related to the court consider that counterproductive and hope it will be reconsidered. The slow pace of cases, including in the Philippines, which was faster than many of us feared. And at the same time that the Philippines case was initiated, the former prosecutor did not seek authorization to proceed with investigations in Nigeria and Ukraine due to budgetary constraints. So it's a real issue, and hope that member states in particular who are engaged in the discussions at the Assembly of States Parties for the ICC take up that question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure the International Criminal Court is listening. Buddy from Franciscans International, our host.
So thank you very much, Father Albert. Thank you very much, Ms. Socorro Reyes, and as well as the panelists online. And we are very happy that we can have these discussions at the Human Rights Council, because I think it's very timely for us to provide feedback on how, especially the UN Joint Program, has been perceived and seen by the civil society, and what is the expectation. So I'm quite happy to hear from Samantha, but also from other panelists, to know that the UN Joint Program has not really addressed the issue of accountability, and therefore there's a need really to have a kind of review, in particular toward the end of the implementation of UN Joint Program. However, my question is two things. First, I would like also to get the information regarding the role of the Commission of Human Rights in pursuing the accountability under the Duterte, but also under the Marcos current administrations. The second thing is that there are a strong call to have another resolutions at this year for the situation in the Philippines. However, we understand that the process is quite difficult and challenging, And there is a recommendations that the Office of the Commissioner should do the review. I would like to know from the panelists, especially from Senator Leila de Lima, what do you think about that request, and what can contribute in the advancement of the accountability if such a review will take place? Thank you.
It's for Leila.
Maybe we hear from Leila first. Senator Leila.
Okay, there are supposed to be two questions. I heard clearly the first one about the role of the Commission on Human Rights, but the second one I could hardly hear. I could hardly understand. So let me first answer the first question about the role of the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission on Human Rights is the national human rights institution here in the country, and certainly it's part of their mandate to investigate all forms of human rights violations, including the killings under the Duterte's war on drugs. What we know is that they have been investigating some of the cases of drug killings, but as to the results thereof, what exactly were the findings of the CHR, we have yet to see that, and I know that I think they have been confronted with certain challenges about accessing witnesses and accessing the families of the victims. They are able to talk to some of them, but in a limited number only. And the CHR has some problem also about its institutional sustainability and mandate, in the sense that until now, it really does not have a separate charter. When I was in the Senate, I've been trying to push for the CHR charter, the expansion of the mandate of the Commission on Human Rights. And well, I'm glad to hear that under the current administration, they're also trying to grant a fiscal, fiscal autonomy of the Commission on Human Rights, because they need that, and not, that their resources are not subject to the whims and caprices of those who hold the power of the purse in Congress. So that's what I know about what the CHR has been confronting these days. Now, may I ask about the second question, please? Because as I said, I could not understand and hear the second question earlier.
I'll try to simplify it. What is your expectation, knowing that the UN joint program will end in June this year? What is your expectation after the UN joint program?
Well, as we heard from Samantha, I think there is a need for independent and thorough evaluation, as well as extension of the UNJP. If its goals and objectives have not been fully met yet, or have not been realized yet, then I think it's but logical to have that extended. And if it has to be replaced by another program, then that new program has to be more comprehensive and its goals more realistic. And I agree with Samantha's view that there's got to be more involvement or engagement of civil society groups in whatever program, whether it's an extension of the UNJP or a new program, such as the human rights, the establishment of the Human Rights Coordinating Council. And I agree that it cannot be just purely a governmental body. There's got to be an independent monitor of that body, as well as its performance.
Issue.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Maraming salamat po, Senator de Lima, and to
Thank you.
as well. My name is Rafael Pamalangan. I'm with the Environment and Climate Change team of OHCHR. And the question I'd like to pose is as to the space of the human rights narrative vis-a-vis the right to a healthy environment. We've heard a lot on accountability vis-a-vis the war on drugs in each of the case, as well as enforced disappearances, but there are intersections between these themes and the right to the environment, specifically vis-a-vis environmental defenders. I'd be interested to know whether this has had its space in the UNJP's work, and whether we could see more focus on this moving forward. Thank you.
Leila, Senator Leila.
I'm not seeing enough focus on that area. Yes, right to a balanced and health and ecology, a balanced ecology is pretty much a human right. But as in terms of program of government, we don't see a concrete human rights-based approach to addressing the challenges under the environmental challenges. And that's a good perspective that there has to be more focus in that area where we're addressing all of this, the drug war killings and cases of enforced disappearances, the abductions. And as you all know also, there has been this recent abduction of 2 young environmentalists. Now they have been freed already, but we heard about their ordeal and this really it's deleterious, the deleterious effects of advocacy of human rights, for the ecological, environmental rights. And we're seeing this defenders, these advocates for that, the environmental defenders being subjected to attacks, coercion, and threats. So that's definitely not good.
Time for a real summary, but probably we have time to thank the people for attending this. We have heard of many powerful concepts: human rights violations, misogyny. We heard about the big concepts: misogyny, human rights violations, even environment. And we heard about proposals to extend the United Nations Joint Program, and probably by July, probably. And so thank you very much for coming. The fact that we don't have much time to discuss the other issues means probably we should come back for another side event in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leila de Lima and Samantha, Sok, and the Franciscans International and everyone else.